why have this forum? What's the presenting thing about talking about the future of conservatism from your perspective? Why does this matter?
There are so many reasons that it matters. I think from my standpoint, we are going through a time of fundamental change. This is not a surprise to anyone in the room, but every institution of society is being transformed by new technologies and new ideas. And when that happens, we have two problems that affect the political process. One, just as you said, on the mental frame with which we approached terrorism was an old mental frame. Came from the Cold War. I think the mental frame that both the liberal progressive and the conservative libertarian movements bring to us are based on old institutions that are no longer in existence in the way that they are assumed to have been. And so when we look at things like marriage, we look at it from an old institutional frame that doesn't match today's reality. And that's true on environment. When we look at environment, and what we hear often from Republican leaders, because it works politically, is, again, pitting the environment against the economy, which is an old frame. It's an out-of-date frame. It's not that it's not true. You know, the EPA does kill jobs. Too much regulation does kill jobs and does harm innovation and does harm the environment. It's not that it's untrue, but it sounds old-fashioned to young voters who assume, rightly, that the environment and the economy can both excel together, and usually do, not always, but usually do. So when Republicans bring these old ideas forward as if they represent cutting-edge thinking, they sound old-fashioned. And so young people who overwhelmingly believe in innovation and free enterprise look to the Democrats for that, not because they think the Democrats have the policies, but because they think the Democrats believe in them. And
the Democrats almost have the brand.
The Democrats have the brand. The Republicans have, in some ways, the policies, but they need to update those policies. You know, when you look to institutions like marriage, again, I come from San Francisco. I was on BART a couple of weeks ago, and somehow got into a conversation about family with a gay couple that happened to be there. And it stimulated them to express their concern about the loss of family values, and how important it was to establish, you know, committed, solid relationships. And they had read the data, and they understood the problem. They had kids themselves, and I realized that here is a gay couple in San Francisco that is expressing deep, passionate support for the institution of marriage and committed lifetime relationships. They believed in it more than many people, you know, many straight couples did. I think the Republican Party needs to recognize that as institutions change, the principles remain, but they take different forms.
Well, before we get kind of into where we want to get to, let's kind of establish a baseline of where we are. What is the San Francisco perception of conservatism today?
Well, you know, the College RNC did a poll recently, and I'd encourage you to read it. I think it's quite useful. But what they found was that there's a set of small R Republicans who find the Republican Party, you know, big R, repugnant to them right now. They strongly believe in core Republican values, but the words that they used, and these are voters who are basically conservative, but who voted for President Obama in the last election. And the words that they expressed that most frequently came to mind when they thought of Republicans were old-fashioned, rigid, racist, outdated, or old. Yeah, I think it was one other term I'm not remembering. But these are the terms that they use, and I think that's the Republican brand in San Francisco. It's old-fashioned, it's rigid, it's outdated. It doesn't understand technology. It doesn't understand social change, and And of course, the fundamental is that it's just pro-corporate, not pro-small business, not pro-entrepreneur, not pro-change, but pro-corporate. The other problem that brings, and it happens on both the right and the left, is that we're in a town of vested interests here. We all have 100 vested interests, and I totally understand why vested interests follow the patterns that they do. But vested interest groups, as we all know, use dog whistle language to attract supporters to policies that embed their vested interests. They do it on the right, they do it on the left. If you want to advance spending on military, you know what words to use when something blows up around the world to generate support for increased military spending. If you want to sell more hospital care, you know the words to use that trigger the left to demand that a whole new population of people get health care. And you know that in the political process, they're going to get health care through the same old institutions by further embedding the power of those institutions. So both the left and the right operate according to this dog whistle pattern that simply embeds the power of vested interests. We need to change that, not because vested interests are evil, because we all are vested interests, but simply because we all have to come together and say our old vested interests are different from our new vested interests. And that means the right and the left have to both look at vested interest control, at their own control, and challenge that.
But isn't it safe to say the Democrats are far better at that than Republicans?
You mean rhetorically or in practice?
Yeah. No. In practice, and actually, establishing, communicating in that way.
I think that they're able to communicate that they care about the values. If you look at Obamacare, for example, here you've got a law that appeals to progressive impulses by saying we're going to guarantee health care for more people, but was pressed through Congress by appealing to vested interest and ensuring that the service that was provided is provided by the same people who have always provided the service in essentially the same way, which means that costs will go up, which means that the system will decline. So Democrats have been very effective at trying to advance progressive ideals, but they've been trapped, just as Republicans have been, by a system that compels them to do so by paying off vested interests along the way.
What does conservatism stand for and who articulates it?
It's an interesting question because conservatism has been so contaminated as a label, as has liberalism and progressivism, that it's almost impossible to adopt those terms. You have to fight so hard to convince people of your definition that you lose the political battle before you start. So I don't call myself a conservative or a liberal or a progressive for that matter, but I believe in certain things that I would consider in this room to represent conservatism, and that is free enterprise, individual initiative, personal responsibility. Those are the kinds of things that I embrace. And I think that those are ideas that are exciting with many who currently side with the left because they believe that the Democratic Party is more at heart in alignment with those principles, even if in terms of policy they don't seem to be going anywhere with it. Yeah, that's what Republicans have to work on. And the challenge that we see every day in our work between corporations and activist groups is that pragmatically in all political battles, the first and easiest strategy to use to win is to demonize the other side. So in battles between corporations and activist groups, the activist groups demonize the companies quite consciously. They strip them of their humanity, treat them as if they're machines, mechanistic and damaging. And our job in engagement is to bring actual people together and break the myth of the demon.
Yet they love Apple.
And they love Apple, which is interesting. And so certain companies, Apple and before them Toyota, were immune to this demonization. Now, at a certain point, they become vulnerable to the demonization. But basically, once a demon, always a demon. So it's always, you know the companies that come to mind when you think of the classic corporate demons. But what needs to happen on the conservative side, as well as on the progressive side, is that people from within those communities need to bring people from the other communities in and break that demon psychology. That's what people hold on to. They want you to say the other side is a demon. and they want you to believe it and show it. You can't convince them otherwise. You have to bring them into a room and where they discover each other's humanity. When they do, we find that the right and the left can come together because they both recognize that something revolutionary has to happen, that the hold of old mental frames, which takes real form in lobbying, has to be broken. Not because these vested interests are evil, but because they're holding us back collectively. And they all, or most of them, will advance better if they all can let go of those interests.
You know, Charlie said something that was interesting here, is that a lot of folks, and I think Dan echoed this as well, is that a lot of conservatives don't feel respected. In your process, you know, when you have a Sierra Club and an energy company, both sides may not feel respected either. How do you start to build up respect?
I think, first of all, we individualize. You know, these groups think of each other as giant groups, all monoliths. So we go through a process where we inventory the stakeholders on all sides, and then we profile them as individuals. Here's somebody from this oil company who has something in common with you. You really want to meet this person. Here's someone from this supposedly radical activist group that actually believes in something that you're doing. You need to meet that person. And so it's a person-to-person engagement that happens. That tends to break the mythology of the monolithic opposition, and it gets people to actually engage with one another. And we find that it takes about 6 months to 2 years, but that the demonization campaigns then peter down to nothing because the ideological rigidity has been blown apart by meeting with one another. Now, it happens, it's interesting. The first time you engage, you often have a very positive meeting. People are just amazed at, my gosh, I talked to this person, I thought he was the devil, turned out to be really good. They go back to their communities and say, I had a really good meeting with the devil this morning. And they say, are you crazy? You have been co-opted by the devil. And so the first person goes back and writes a press release condemning the devil again to convince his or her colleagues that he or she hasn't gone over to the dark side. And then, of course, the company in this case says, we're never dealing with them again. We had a nice meeting, then they attacked us back. We have to counsel and handhold through that process because it takes about 6 months for that to stop happening. And then the groups coalesce, and then they're in the real world, not the idealized world. Now it's easier for him to convey anger because it reinforces the recalcitrant, do-nothing Republican theme. These Republicans are not going to do anything. It also creates an opportunity, though, that I think Republicans have not captured yet, because it opens the door to the positive frame, to the change-oriented frame. And something I learned a long time ago from a libertarian who was trying to penetrate the progressive resistance to some of his ideas. And he said, before they care what we know, they need to know that we care. And that stayed with me ever since. The fundamental thing that I think Republicans need to do to be able to reach those closet Republicans that could support the party, and it takes substantive change on the issues as well. But the first thing Republicans have to do is convey that they care about the objectives that, I'm sorry to say it, progressives care about. That they care about the environment, that they care about women, that they care about Hispanics, that they care about gay and lesbian citizens, and so on. Now, it's easy to trigger a negative from the Republican side for very good reasons, because these are not cohesive groups of identical individuals, and Republicans resent the victimization of whole groups. But I think that if you look in the women's empowerment movement, for example, right now, which tends to be associated with the Democrats more than the Republicans, but the movement itself is not about victimhood. It's not about women being victims and needing society to swoop in to save them. It's about the power of women. And that's a movement that is resonant with core Republican values. But right now it's being abandoned by Republicans because it's viewed as a democratic, as a democratic vehicle and a pro-choice vehicle and so on. That's a missed opportunity. I think that, another of the missed opportunities of the Republican Party right now has been the tendency to dismiss all of climate science because of the belief that if you accept climate science, you have to accept a big government solution to climate problems. And I understand why this emerges. I totally understand. On the right, there is a commitment to decentralized power, to small business and entrepreneurial business, and to competition. Then they recognize that central government action, while the left may idealize it as the way to finally push through justice and peace and environmental sustainability, that centralized government power actually leads to the opposite of those. That's an insight, that's a knowing that Republicans and conservatives have that progressives just don't get until they live it, until they experience it. When the Republicans completely sweep away climate science as if there is no basis for it whatsoever, they leave the entire field of play to the Democrats. And more than that, they leave the entire field of play to vested interests that collectively can wield majority Democratic support. And that means you do come through with an agenda that is a big government agenda, where there are effectively takeovers of huge chunks of the economy. Republicans need to have an agenda on climate, or they leave the field open to the Democrats. And we will have a messy, state-by-state proliferation of big government solutions that don't go anywhere. That's what's going to happen. Probably not a federal law, but thousands of state and local measures. To me, this is an extraordinary opportunity. The best approach, if you speak with conservative economists, to the climate issue is to shift taxes, as many of the people in the room know. It's an ideal opportunity for Republicans to actually do something, shifting down taxes on income, on payroll, on corporate profits, and shifting them up on pollution, on carbon, or if people don't want to believe carbon is a pollutant, then on a market basket of pollution. That's something that virtually every conservative economist knows is a good idea. It's good for the economy. It's good for prosperity. It's good for innovation. And over time, because pollution declines at about 1 or 2 or 3% a year, taxes decline at about 1 or 2 or 3% a year. So if Republicans actually believe in reducing taxes over time, reducing the power of government, reducing the power of the EPA to overregulate the economy, then this is a natural for them. But right now, of course, dogmatically, it's not possible to even acknowledge climate as a legitimate issue. If the Republicans are to appear to be current to young voters, they're going to have to get over that in this next cycle. They're going to have to offer an alternative to the big government non-solution to climate. So many small-scale entrepreneurs that are hemmed in by overregulation at the city level. I speak with them all the time, and they're on the left and they're on the right politically. They need liberation from that. We have this old, industrial, decades-old approach to industrializing everything and making everything the same. And on the left, you have a tremendous pent-up demand to change. And if the Republican Party can tap that, even in San Francisco, if the Republican Party were out there demanding competition to yellow taxi with all the shared vehicle services and so on, and all the shared economy enterprises that are emerging, you'd see people saying, my gosh, I'm going to become a San Francisco Republican. Maybe it's a little different, but I'm going to become a San Francisco Republican because they're liberating me to pursue the kind of food that I want, the kind of lifestyle that I want, to do things with my property that don't fit into the codes, and so on. Big opportunity there. But you can't talk about efficiency and you can't talk about free markets in that regard. You have to speak the language that comes from them and then draw them in, and they will believe in free markets once they understand that you're not talking about corporate control. It's easy to kind of deride the folks that live in think tanks. But I think that we find a lot of fascinating solutions in the conservative think tank community. And those solutions are often cast in the language of the 1970s, let's say, and very much appeal backward in time in the language that's used, but the ideas themselves are very much alive. I think that what Republicans have done by putting educational choice on the table is extremely important. It runs against the deep, democratic power that groups like the teachers' unions and the education establishment have, another vested interest. These are not evil people, they're not bad people, they're just doing what the system dictates that they do, which is to advance their parochial interests ahead of the broader public interest. And they have been successful in preventing the Democratic Party to a great degree from recognizing that schools have to adapt, they have to change, and that people deserve some choice. So I think Republicans are very good at putting charters on the table and putting vouchers on the table. They probably need new terms and new language, to deal with things that have been corrupted there. Coupons, there you go. I mean, it's true. In San Francisco, it's a ludicrous system that we're involved in there, and certainly more choice makes more sense. More use of the market, the ownership principle, but not referring it to the ownership principle. Stewardship is the key. The ownership principle to the left implies corporate control and materialism. That's not what the right means by ownership. They mean taking personal responsibility. That's something the left can actually embrace. Taking personal responsibility is what they're about. But when they think of it as stewardship, not as ownership. So these terms that are used on the right are offensive to people on the left because they define them differently. If we begin to talk about stewardship and making sure that when people do harm to society, they're held accountable for that harm through things like shifting taxes from, prosperity to actual harm, to pollution, then you're embedding Republican principles in a system where people can finally relate to the party.
Bill, what advice would you give for conservatives in terms of tactics and strategies?
Well, first of all, stay the course in terms of change. It's interesting to me, because President Obama won the last election. It wasn't as much a blowout as it's popularly now cast as. He could have lost. President Romney could be in place. And the Democrats would be gathered, talking about the future of liberalism. And in 2014, if the Republicans happen to take the Senate, then all this talk of Republicans updating their party is going to fall behind until they lose in 2016. If they don't take the Senate, then the Republican self-examination will continue. Both parties are stuck 2 or 3 generations in the past. Both of them need to change. It's not just the Republican Party that needs to. If the Republican Party is the first to change, it has the advantage.
Yeah, somebody's going to win.
Stay the course. No matter what happens in 2014, stay the course, drive change in the party. That doesn't mean becoming Rockefeller Republicans. It doesn't mean taking a point halfway between liberal and conservative so that you appeal to the middle. It means embracing those core Republican values, but applying them in new, modern, forward-thinking ways. It means celebrating the principles that are embodied in institutions that are traditionally important, and recognizing and explaining why those institutions hold and help to advance those values, but not holding to a strict interpretation of the form of those institutions if that means really sacrificing the principles in the process. Understanding and valuing tradition is important. Holding to the forms of tradition when they've gone out of date sacrifices the principles that are the most important part of them. On the part of any ideological group is to force their core reality onto the real world. And of course, their core reality is oversimplified and not real. So when you talk to environmentalists, they are so passionate about protecting this extraordinary, complex system that produces so much value that it's unacknowledged, that they want government to come in and slam controls and prevent anything from happening. And the right is so dedicated to this free-flowing economic system that produces so much value that no one acknowledges that they want to come in and slam the environment and say, let's control the environment so we can allow this free-flowing system to continue to create value. Our point is that these are the same systems, actually, just viewed through different lenses, and that these extraordinary systems of the free market and natural ecosystems, that's where value comes from. And Republicans need to acknowledge that. If they don't, then the instinct of ideological groups to superimpose their designed perfect society is going to continue. And the big government approach is, because of the left's tendency to believe that people are good and they'll do good as long as they're not corrupted by evil institutions, they believe that if you put all the power in government, which is not profit-centered, that government will do good and that people will do good in that construct. I understand why they believe that, but it's not true. The opposite is the case. The right needs to take what they call property rights and translate it into terms that the left can understand. It's absolutely true in free market environmentalism that when you don't have defined property, you have exploitation. On the left, on the right, that's very understandable. When we work with organizations to stop deforestation in the third world, it's very obvious to us that one of the driving forces behind deforestation is the fact that nobody has clear land title. And so everybody, when they get access to it, strips it bare as fast as they can and gets out of there. So property rights are key to environmental sustainability, but it's not recognized. The term property rights is, again, offensive to the left because they see it as the same thing as materialism and consumerism and corporate control. So we need to change that language to draw them in.
Mm-hmm. If I do have a real issue, and I know it may conflict with what somebody else believes, but I still want to work with them on 70% of the other things. Am I able to hold my moral stance and still be able to work with folks?
I think you need to engage and listen. And as you engage and listen, you learn how to express what's deeply and passionately important to you. This is key, and we have to remind ourselves of this every time we're speaking with a stakeholder. We need to listen first. If we listen first, they share what they're passionately interested in, and we have to translate what they're passionate about into the underlying principles that are legitimate, because we may not share the objective that they have, the specific way that they want to get to that point. But once they express what they're passionate about, we almost always discover that we are passionate about that also. We just may have a better way of getting there or a different way of getting there. So I think we have to engage first of all. It breaks the demonization process. We have to listen second, because you can't, as I said earlier, they won't understand, they won't care what you know until they know that you care. They won't care what you know until they know that you care. You have to listen to them, validate what's important to them, and then express what's important to you, and then you can bring them together. I think the tendency to instantly demonize is something that we need to intellectually separate ourselves from. We deal with demonizing conflicts every day between corporations and activist groups. We know that we're dealing with a narrative that is perpetuated by the media and by instincts that are embedded in us tribally, that we have a tendency to form tribes very quickly and to define the alternate tribe as the evil force, because it allows us to close our minds, deny their humanity, and kill them. And this is a tribal instinct that we bring into politics, and it works functionally. We're not going to convince the parties, the activist groups, and others to stop demonizing. But what we have to do is acknowledge that it's a tactic, not a reality. That demonization, unfortunately, works in politics, and it works in the media, and it works in activism, and people are going to use it pragmatically. But we have to recognize that it's only a tactic, that it's a regrettable tactic, that it isn't based on reality, that the opposition is not evil, that the evil people are not the problem. It's the good people who are trapped in ideologies that are limiting that's the problem. The evil people, we separate them out, pretty easily because they're evil. But the good people are the ones that live inside these mental shells that have to be broken. And it's bringing those sides together that is the key. Opportunities like this that bring together different strands of the right and that inject progressive ideas into the discussion as well are key. And opportunities like this to bring together the left and the right to recognize that they are all being manipulated not by evil, corporate and government interests, but by the tendency of all institutions to support what will embed their power.
Status quo.
To support the status quo. We're all part of the status quo. There are very few, if there are any, evil corporations or evil government agencies, despite popular sentiment. There are good people doing things that advance their interests and their institutional interests. And we all have to, at some point, get together and say, our institutional interests collectively are tying us down and forcing us to stay in the past. And the collective deadwood on the ground is going to lead to a fire like we have in Southern California that's going to take down the system if we're not able to clear that deadwood.